From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. All right, we are live on the Acres USA podcast, joined with Dr. Patrick Freese. Dr. Freese is a soil health scientist and R&D technical specialist at Ward Laboratories. He has a PhD in soil chemistry from Washington State University and has worked on soil health, heavy metal chemistry, and international research. And I'm sure I've missed a couple things there, but Dr. Freese, thank you for joining us. He's a consistent writer for us as well in the magazine, if you've seen his articles, and we're excited to have him on the podcast. And he's speaking at He has a session at EcoAg this year. So,
yeah, thanks, Taylor. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Absolutely. I guess, how does one get into the position that you're in with all these nice degrees and certifications and working for one of the largest companies in our industry?
Yeah, it's kind of I guess it's been kind of a weird journey for me. I guess coming here to Ward. Primarily, my background was in environmental quality, so I did my undergraduate in Reno in environmental science and chemistry, primarily focusing on soil and water quality. A lot of it was forest soils, was my background for soil science, and I really enjoyed it quite a bit. And I also didn't want to get bored in my career, so I figured soils would be the best thing to kind of focus on, just because they are so complicated. So you have to know physics, water science, chemistry, everything. But again, I was trying to do environmental quality. So I did my undergraduate there and did my PhD at Washington State in heavy metal attenuation or remediation in old orchard soils with different soil amendments. So getting into more contaminants, and then really into the soil science, soil chemistry realm. And then during that time, I spent a year in Thailand working with, it was on a Fulbright, working with rice growers impacted by cadmium contamination in rice paddies. So that was really interesting, really, disheartening work, but I mean, it was just because of the issues they were having, but really good work for the most part. And during my undergraduate, I spent some time in sub-Saharan Africa working with indigenous tribes impacted by mining activities, so contaminated soils and water and that. So that was really, I was quite immersed in that. Working in South Texas for a little bit on King Ranch, doing site assessments. COVID hit and everyone got laid off. And so I thought, well, I'm really good with chemistry and method development. That's what I've done quite a bit of. And so I kind of segued into proper ag and environmental testing. And a few years later, I ended up with Ward as their director of research and development. And so that's kind of how I got here.
Very cool. What's been your experience in academia? Like, there's a lot of people in our industry that have almost a negative relationship with their time in academia. Did you feel any pressure or pushback, or you think it's getting better now than maybe it used to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of ego. There's a lot of egos and big heads in academia. But the work that's produced from it, the high quality work, the stringent regulations, and the peer review process, I would say it is. I would say it is getting more relaxed. Just because people still live in the real world. They still have their own human lives that they have to deal with, and so I think it's always a balance with people. So I feel like it's still pretty good now. With a lot of the funding being cut in some areas, it's probably even more stressful for them now. Because they have to look for more private industry for funding for research. But as long as the standards are still quite high, it's always weird. Is the juice worth the squeeze? As they say, is it worth the headache? I wasn't an academic type. I mean, I'm academic, but I didn't want to stay in academia. I wasn't a paper writer or a grant writer. I've done that, but it wasn't really the drive that I wanted professionally. So I liked the application in industry, though. I like to keep that standard, but provide it to the general public through industry work. So that's kind of how I ended up here.
Got it. So, as a soil health scientist, is that would you classify yourself as that?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. I mean, health is kind of a broad term. We have
Yeah.
the health practices now. We do like soil health testing, respiration. Some people do the Haney test, things like that. But for me, with heavy metals and environmental pollution, that was also the other side of soil health that people don't really classify as proper soil health that we think of today. So I would say, yeah, broadly, I just cover all the bases with soil health.
Yeah. So, what does soil health mean to you in practical terms?
Yeah, so it's in practical terms, it's just supporting the natural function of the soil, what they call sustainable practices. And some people call it biomimicry. So utilizing the natural function of the soil for our own benefit. So the natural function of the soil, all things being equal, is to support plant life for the most part. I mean, the soil is just there as a byproduct of like weathering and things like that, but it's very nutrient dense, and plants, are supported by it. But in turn, we can use those same processes for our own agronomic purposes. So really, it's just supporting that function, not tapping out those resources and managing it sustainably. So you're not mining the soil, or overexerting it.
What have you seen? Let's use an example of someone or some soil that's been mined in the past. What is some of the steps that you would help someone with to get moving in the right direction?
Yeah, so I see this quite a bit. So, like people who are going from conventional to organic or regenerative agronomic practices, typically, or even I've seen this with like deer hunters. They're growing food plots for hunting, and they're not farmers, but they'll inherit or acquire land, old farmland that's just been beaten to death, and they don't know where to start. So in all those systems, it's the same thing. So typically, I recommend doing just a basic fertility test. I want to see the baseline. I want to see what the pH is. Sometimes you'll see salt issues in these old, very heavily managed soils. They just build up the salt, and that is a big fertility issue. So, seeing all those like broad strokes first. What are those broad strokes that kind of govern some of the chemistry look like? And then from there, we look at some of the basic fertility aspects, so nitrogen, NPK, all that, micronutrients. But when they really want to start heading into the soil health realm, um, you know, you have to initially do some of those practices, kind of initially condition the soil, but then also incorporate things like cover crops. Both. So never leave the soil bare is the best practice for that, winter or any other time that you're not growing something. So how to incorporate those practices, and then the realistic expectations in terms of when they see results, both in the field, but then also with the soil data. And typically, it's about like 2 to 5 growing seasons. Normally, about two, you'll see really large differences between the start and then that point, and differences in soil texture, organic matter, water infiltration. If you've had like a heavily managed soil, you'll see compaction issues, and that is really kind of the sort of prescriptive nature of some of the cover crops, is to break through that hard pan, get the water infiltrated, and then that will help kind of support some of these other processes, like if it is a salt buildup, washing out some of those salts and things like that. So those little initial steps, don't hit it hard at first. You don't want to do every test under the sun, because you're just going to get a bunch of data you don't know how to interpret. But for a lot of this is just seeing those broad strokes and then kind of piecemealing it in from there.
What are some of the cover crop species you recommend for helping with compaction?
So those are the brassicas. So those are typically anything with a deep root, but those are like, per the books, the best ones to apply. So mustards and things like that. Actually, I was speaking with an almond grower on the West Coast who had heavily compacted soils. So he had pictures of the inner rows during like a rain event, and it was just standing water through the whole area. He planted brassicas or mustards in the inner rows, and within one growing season, they had broken through the hard pan enough to allow the water to infiltrate. So they're very prescriptive in that nature. Anything with a really deep root, but those are the ones to go with.
And when you mentioned that you had seen some of these soils that were heavy with salt, like what's causing that?
So again, with the compaction, so you'll have water standing. So it's either a compaction or a groundwater issue, or both. So they kind of like synergistically work together. So typically, if you have compaction, you'll have standing water. And as the water sits there, it's pulling out salts from the soil or from the groundwater, if it's from irrigation. And since they're not draining out, they just kind of build up with time on top of the soil. And you even see this in conventional systems with a lot of irrigation. If you look on the edges of the fields, you'll see like white crystals kind of build up. So you can literally see the salts. But in some areas, like in the West Coast, where they have more arid climates, they'll have salty groundwater, and you're taking that salty water and applying it. And so those salts, even if you have decent infiltration, they'll still build up in the soil with time. So it's kind of these, different areas that can contribute to a salt buildup in soil.
Yeah. What does soil carbon kind of play? What's its role in all of this? What are you seeing in these depleted soils? As the carbon level is really low, how do they build them back up?
Yeah, so for the carbon aspect, it's carbon's such a hot topic. It has been for like the past, I would say, 10 years, especially with the carbon sequestration markets and everything, which we do quite a bit of work here. But our understanding of carbon has really expanded quite a bit. So, what do the different, fractions or pools of carbon? What roles do they actually play in both developing organic matter, but going into the high quality organic matter? So you have these active and then stable fractions that kind of do these different job functions. I would say, for most impacted soils with pH, salt, low native fertility, if you have enough carbon in the soil, and I'm not saying artificially stuff it, like over applying soil amendments like compost or biochar or things like that, but if you're naturally building up the organic matter, so nationally we have a range. In the West Coast, where we have more arid soils, it can be anywhere from like 0.5% all the way up to other areas like on the East Coast or the Midwest, where you'll see 5 to 6% organic matter. And that roughly equates to about, one to like 3 to 4% organic carbon. If you have enough of that built up in the soil, it really is an excellent buffer in terms of the impacts that you can get from salt buildup, pH. And I've seen this in areas, especially in western Colorado with the peach growers. Now that soil is typically a higher pH soil. It's more alkaline, but these are organically produced peaches. So they're applying things like compost and other organic amendments, and so their carbon numbers are so high that they don't see any sort of issues from the high pH, and that's typically a deficiency that it causes. You'll see like chlorosis or things like that, iron chlorosis. So I don't see any issues in their soil. And also in Minnesota, I've seen this as well. In Minnesota, they grow rice because they have such high water tables in some of those areas, which is really surprising. I had no idea they were growing rice there, but I did a tour through there, a field tour, and I could see the rice fields.
What parts of Minnesota I didn't know that either.
Yeah, it's like southwest parts of Minnesota.
Yeah.
So that's
that makes sense.
Yeah, and it was kind of surprising, but in high water table areas, kind of like the standing water issue, you'll have saltier soils, but they do practice. They do have regenerative practices in those areas as well, and so from the high carbon that they have in their soils, they don't have any salt impact issues. Even if they're applying soil amendments that they themselves have salts that they're adding to the soil, they still don't see the deficiencies that or like low water availability that the salts will cause. So building up that organic matter through cover crops or soil amendments, especially no-till practices, no-till or minimal till. If you till the soil, you're essentially breaking it open, re-exposing that organic matter to air, and then it starts breaking down faster. Which is why conventional systems are so depleted, is that they're constantly tearing up the soil. But if you let the microbes do their work along with the roots, everything's kind of stabilized, and then it has time to accumulate and build and become more nutrient dense.
Hello, everybody. This year marks a milestone, the 50th annual Acres U.S.A. EcoAg Conference and Trade Show, happening December 1st through the 4th, 2025 in Madison, Wisconsin. For 5 decades, this event has been the nation's premier gathering for farmers, ranchers, researchers, and industry leaders who believe in building soil health, resilient farm systems, and thriving rural economies. Join us for 4 days of expert-led workshops, dynamic keynote sessions, and the largest EcoAg trade show in the country, all designed to give you the tools and connections you need to grow smarter and farm with a purpose. This year's lineup includes innovators like Gabe Brown, Joel Salatin, Rick Clark, Neil Kinsey, Dr. James White, Dr. Don Huber, Helen Attow, Dan Kittredge, Will Harris, Aaron Silva, Dr. Nasha Winters, and many, many more. Don't miss your chance to be part of this historic 50th anniversary celebration at EcoAg 2025. Register today at the link in the bio. What would be important for organic producers who aren't quite to the no-till phase to maintain that soil carbon, even if they're tilling? Ideally, you'd probably say don't till every year, but maybe every other year.
Yeah, for the organic folks, I've noticed it's soil amendments. So they are very big into soil amendments and also biostimulants. But for the ones that are using biostimulants, things like humic and fulvic acids, they're normally doing no-till practices as well. I would say broadly, those have different, functions. And I've done some talks, and actually I wrote an article for Acres on biostimulants. But they have different functions in terms of when you apply them and what you're expected to see and in what systems they work. But if they are tilling, I've noticed that they do like to apply things like compost, manures. Some do biochars, but biochar is much more prescriptive. But usually it's like compost and manures that they are applying. In some of those cases, you can have issues with salts, especially with manures, and also heavy metals, which I'll be talking about at the conference this year. But manures, they tend to concentrate both of those things, salts and heavy metals. So the thing is that you have to really watch what you're applying, mostly through soil testing, looking at heavy metals and then also the salts, pH, things like that, along with your fertility from the soil results. But if you're still tilling, you need to get that carbon in the soil some way. And since you're tearing up the roots, you're going to have to reapply those, organic components through some sort of amendment of some kind.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're talking about the heavy metal thing this year at the conference, because I don't know if anyone else is really touching on it. At least they're not diving into a whole session on it. So you can have essentially a healthy system, but you're still seeing some of these healthy systems have issues with heavy metals in them. I guess let's break down what you plan on talking about at the conference, and then where you're seeing these heavy metals coming in from.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. When I got into when I made the proper transition to ag from environmental quality, I thought, well, um, maybe I'll never see contaminants again. But it's actually come up way more working in ag than anything, even working directly in environmental remediation. Just because people acquire soils, and you don't really think to test for heavy metals, you just think fertility. I have this old, heavily managed soil, and that looks depleted. I need to look at NPK, pH, organic matter. But then when they go to grow something, something that's going to be consumed, like for example, a cannabis grower that I worked with in Western Colorado, they acquired an old conventionally managed system. I think it was an old orchard soil. And they found that the plants were taking up arsenic, lead, and cadmium. And for a crop like cannabis that's consumed, especially for people with compromised immune systems, which is the broad target, the regulations are very stringent on that. So they had to toss the entire crop. So that's an instance where you acquire land and you don't think that to test for these things, but you're also provided with very little site history outside of, oh, it was an old dairy, or, oh, it was an old, they did row crops for 30 years. That's very broad because there could be some transitions in there that could have introduced some of these contaminants. So I see it typically in old orchard soils, and that's what I did my research on in grad school was heavily what they call co-contaminated soil. So they have more than one heavy metal. So they'll have lead, cadmium, and then a metalloid, arsenic, although people just call it a heavy metal because it kind of falls into that same group. But from the late 1800s to the mid 1900s, they applied lead arsenic pesticides in old orchards. So apple, pear, peach, to treat codling moths. And it was also applied to lawns. And I have actually showed some old footage during my defense to my committee that I found from Washington State, where they were applying the old grainy black and white footage. They're applying lead arsenic pesticides to lawns, like golf courses and lawns and things like that, with like a fire hose. They were just spraying it on like crazy. And the issue with this is that the soil is like a sponge. It'll suck this stuff up. And if you're applying it every year, I mean, you're talking about massive amounts of heavy metals building up in your soil, especially if you're doing it for like 6, 7 decades. So in these areas, because they're prime real estate, especially for orchard soils, I mean, you're talking about very kind of like mountainous areas, near water systems, very well drained soils, even though the metals still stay there. But in Washington and in other parts of the U.S. and even the world, they sold this land for development. And so people found they had about 1,000 parts per million of lead and 700 parts per million of arsenic in their backyard. And they had no idea to even check for that. I mean, in the background, the natural background for arsenic is like, anywhere from 10 to 15 parts per million at the highest, I would say. It's usually about 5 parts per million. And lead is usually anywhere from 15 to 30 parts per million, although I've seen it up to 50 naturally occurring. And that's okay for the most part, but you're talking about like mining waste, level concentrations of heavy metals, and the only way to get rid of it is to replace the soil or add something to keep it in the soil and not in the dust or plants that you're growing or things like that. So it's very like in these isolated spots. There's also related to mining activity and things like that, historic leaded paint use, and those are very isolated. But the wide stretches of land affected are the ones where you've seen these old orchard practices going on. So it's very much it's always gut wrenching because people again they don't think to test the soil for these things. But I try to work with them to kind of correct or limit the exposure risks that they have.
So you would say the main culprit here is previous chemical inputs that had these metals in it. But how long are you seeing that they're staying in the soil?
Oh, they're just there. I mean, so the expected shelf life of heavy metals in the soil is in the hundreds of years until they're down to levels that aren't uh, you know health risks for people. Mostly because they just for lead and cadmium, they stick to organic matter like really effectively, which is good for remediation because you can apply things to keep them in the soil. But if you just want to get them out of the soil, well, they're there. So you're going to have to either replace the soil or find some other way to get them out. And for arsenic, these all have different chemistries. For arsenic, it sticks to iron and aluminum, and iron and aluminum are quite ubiquitous in soils. And these are all direct bonds, meaning that they're stuck there, and it takes quite a bit to dislodge them or pull them out. Which again is good for remediation practices. You can apply things like iron and biochar, but once they're in the soil, I mean, they're there for a very long time.
So you're seeing biochar as an actual tool to remediate these things.
Oh yeah, so like for people who don't know what biochar is, it's not exactly like charcoal, but it's a controlled burn of biomass. So any sort of residue from a previous crop or wood material, and you're talking anywhere from a few hundred to about 1,000 degrees C burn, control burn, to where you're just charring it enough, and that creates this really reactive material that will absorb quite a bit of heavy metals, and it's become quite popular just because it's cheap to make in some cases. I mean, not always because you do have to have the energy inputs, but you can also formulate it. So you can enrich it with iron, you can enrich it with silica or gypsum to do this kind of double duty work in some of these areas where you have things like cadmium, lead, arsenic, multiple metals in the system that require different chemistries and approaches. So it is a very popular tool, and it's also stable. So you're thinking you're burning this material, you're removing anything that's going to be, I would say, reactive or in terms of microbiology in the soil, where the microbes will attack it, which isn't always bad, But compared to something like compost, compost is very bioactive. So whenever you apply it, it has to marinate for quite a bit in the soil for it to kind of settle down and do its job. Whereas biochar, you apply it and it has a shelf life of anywhere from like 5 years up to like several decades. In terms of its efficacy, though, it has a much better long-term shelf life than just something like compost.
Yeah. So what are some of the other affordable strategies? And I guess before I ask that, like, what is your estimate of how many different consumable foods are people eating with these heavy metals in that we don't even know about?
Oh gosh, it depends on where you're getting them. So this is really interesting, especially if you're getting stuff that's locally sourced. And again, if they're not testing some of these materials, or just like selling them on roadsides or little shops or giving them to restaurants locally. That's a big problem. So it's usually it's with vegetables, so it's very crop specific. The big impacted ones are leafy vegetables. So with plants, and depending on the metal, they typically will translocate or distribute the metals uh, primarily in the roots and then in the leaves. And then after that, it's the fruiting bodies. And now for some of them, like cadmium, cadmium is probably the worst culprit across the board because plants will suck that up and it goes through all out the plant. So it typically hits fruiting bodies, leaves, stems, and then the roots at the very last part of it. And it's not for every crop, but that's the big menacing one. So typically, with that, with leafy green vegetables, because you're eating the leaves, and that's where it normally ends up initially. That's the big one. So spinach and Swiss chard are the big ones that you don't want to. You want to at least make sure that you have some information on in terms of where they're grown or if they have them tested or whatnot. And I've spoken with a few individuals who do get locally sourced foods that are in close relation to maybe old mining sites or things like that. These are very like mountainous areas. So they at least had it in their head that they should be more aware of these things. Other things like rice. So working in Thailand, rice is a submerged crop. It's a very wet crop. And with that, you have very low oxygen in that kind of wet zone. And in that state, heavy metals will come into solution pretty effectively, and the rice just sucks it up. It goes right into the grain. And with that, they had all like thousands of these renal failure cases. So your kidneys are primarily impacted from cadmium. They were just showing up in this region, northwest Thailand, for no reason. Like they had no idea. They finally traced it back to the rice, which was near a zinc mine. And so they were mining for zinc, and zinc and cadmium are what they call chemical analogs or chemical sisters. They have near identical chemistries, and it's enriched in cadmium. The big rain events were coming through. This is like monsoon area, and it was just washing everything out, going right down into the rice paddies. And so they were thinking that it's clean, same as you getting anything locally sourced, but they were having all these health cases. So rice, leafy green vegetables, anything touching the soil, really. And that's a big one for lead. So root vegetables and and also brassicas. Brassicas also they do take up a bit more lead and cadmium, but a lot for lead is the touching of the soil. But really for root vegetables, just washing it will remove about 30 to 70% of the attached lead. And then also if you're peeling it, that's another thing that it gets rid of almost all of it, I would say. So it's a kind of a surface attachment issue with lead. Um, mostly because lead, it's a very large molecule, and so plants do struggle to take it up comparatively. But for something like cadmium, it sits on the back of the calcium and zinc channels in the plant, and plants take up quite a bit of calcium, and also zinc in smaller amounts. But because of that, the plants can't discern what's cadmium and what's calcium, so it'll just suck everything up. And so it really depends on what the element that you're looking at in terms of, and then also the crop in terms of the effect. But those are the big ones. If it's a vegetable, if it's on the ground, if it's a leafy green vegetable where they accumulate most of the metals, that's really kind of what you look for. And it is coming up, I would say, in these kind of little pockets of people who are getting locally sourced produce.
Well, that's my first argument against locally sourced produce that I've heard.
And I know
It's a
that's what I
tough
thought
one.
too. Was
It's
like,
a tough one
yeah,
to.
and yeah,
So,
they just think it. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
what health problems were they seeing in Thailand? Like, what were some of the health concerns that drew the attention there?
Yeah, so for the Thailand for the cadmium, it was kidney failure. So kidney cancers and kidney failure. That's primarily what the cadmium attacks, and so and it's kind of weird because you think, where is this coming from? But they were consuming rice, like 3 or 4 times a day. It's in everything. They eat it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They don't eat like cereal or oatmeal like, we eat here or whatever you eat for breakfast. They eat the same thing for breakfast as they do for lunch and dinner. So like a meat and then rice. And I've given conferences in Thailand where we had local rice farmers come in, and we were teaching them about soil science and soil testing and things like that. And we gave them. I got to see how they're actually eating a lot of the rice, and they were eating piles of rice. I mean, it was just like a family sized plate of rice, and that's because they're their main food source. So that was why the impacts were so prevalent, was that they were just getting multiple doses per day, days on end, and then all these kidney impacts were starting to show up.
Hey, eco farmers. This is Taylor Henry with Acres U.S.A. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy interviewing these folks. If you're serious about regenerative agriculture, I've got an incredible resource you need to check out: the Acres U.S.A. membership. You farm in the physical world, and you deserve a physical printed magazine to match. Since 1971, Acres U.S.A. magazine has been the leading voice in ecological agriculture, delivering the best insights from regenerative farmers, agronomists, and researchers to help you farm profitably without toxic chemicals. Our membership included physical and digital copies of the magazine each month of the year, which has always been a standard for Acres U.S.A., but we wanted to over-deliver on content. When I acquired this business, I was happy to find that we had years of audio files from presentations at our annual EcoAg conference. And guess what? They were hiding. Well, not anymore. We developed this membership portal that gives you access to the recordings from farmers like Gabe Brown, Gary Zimmer, Joel Salatin, and Mark Shepard. We also include recordings of private events. Finally, if you are like me and you like listening to content, we are now producing a membership-only podcast of each issue of the magazine, so you can consume each article while you're out in the field. To make things even sweeter, you'll get discounts on books, workshops, and events to keep expanding your knowledge. So are you ready to take your farming to the next level? Join today for a ridiculously low price at eco-farming.com, or see details in the notes. And are you seeing a higher concentration of this in, like, I'm thinking of like topography, like lower lying areas where they're seeing the washout sit and settle? Are, ridge tops better or worse? Or I suppose
Yeah,
rice is always grown in low areas too. So
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so it's usually the low-lying areas where they accumulate a lot of the heavy metals during like rain events and things like that. But then also, a lot of these elements are traveling on soil particles, and so you can imagine if you have a lot of washout or rain events, it's all just being transported. Now, for things like mercury, that's a kind of interesting one because in the higher elevation areas, you will see some of the buildup there, just because you have gas phase, mercury. And so, from mining activity, because they use mercury to extract gold, you'll just have mercury. And they did a lot of this research in Nevada because of the heavy mining. They found that mercury was just billowing off of these heap leach stacks, going up into the atmosphere, and then it comes back down. If you're in a mountainous area, it hits those high areas and it binds to like trees and organic matter. So, in some of these areas, it depends on the topography in relation to a contamination source and what that contaminant is. But yeah, usually it's the low-lying areas that really get it quite bad.
So, what tests does Ward Lab have for a producer to see if they have these heavy metals in their soil?
Yeah, no, that's a big one is the test. So there's a few different ways to look at it. Per the EPA, a lot of their stuff is based on total concentration. So you take a soil sample, you'll use acid plus heat to completely dissolve that sample. So you're going to get the total, every different possible form of, like, say, cadmium or arsenic that's in that sample. Now, not all of that's available or bioavailable. Really, there's usually just like a small percentage that's even going to be taken up or consumed, and that's even like if you eat the soil, which is a lot of what the EPA regulations are based on. Are like kids eating soil because that's what kids do. So you have to kind of come at it a different way, and this is really important if you are applying a remediation strategy like biochar or iron or silica for arsenic. You can't go back and do another total analysis because you're just you're not removing anything really. You're just kind of immobilizing it in place. You want to see how effective that immobilization approach actually is. So then you come in and you can apply, say, DTPA, which is a normal fertility test. It's micronutrient test. So DTPA is a chelator, comes from the Greek or Latin that means claw, because it grabs onto micronutrients and makes them more available. So it kind of mimics a root exudate. But that's a really good proxy for what the plant is going to see. You can also just plant something and see what the plant takes up and analyze the plant, which is also another digest. But if you do a DTPA or something that's more plant available in terms of how it works, that's a good way to determine the efficacy of your amendment that you're applying. So normally you come at it with a total digest, but with the understanding that that total number isn't really going to be all impacting your livelihood. You have to really kind of see what the plant sees.
Yeah. So someone tests it. They see that they have heavy metals in there. What are some of the ways to combat that, to prevent the plant uptake of these metals?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite parts of. It's always gut wrenching work because I hate seeing people either affected by this or acquiring land that they had no idea was either ag or even a residential area. But the strategy is dictated by what are you doing with the soil is what I always ask first. Are you going to be planting something? Are you just going to be growing a lawn? Because sometimes you don't. If the best thing is just to not touch the soil. In many cases, if there's grass growing on it and you're not really going to be growing anything else in there, the best thing is to not mess with the soil because that exposure, that disturbance and exposure, just increases the risk. Um, so ask what they're doing, and a lot of individuals say, "I'm either using this for ag, so if it's a large stretch of land, or I want to grow a garden in my backyard." So from there, there's a few different ways you can manage this. From a garden perspective, they always recommend raised beds. That's like the best way to really reduce any sort of metal uptake in plants. It's just to use a raised bed garden. Now, if you don't have access to a raised bed or you don't have the money or any sort of way to install a raised bed, you can apply certain amendments. Same with the large ag operations that are affected by heavy metals. So depends on the metal though. So it gets into some hairy chemistry, but for the most part, lead and cadmium, zinc, copper, some of these other ones that are heavily enriched in the soil, those all have positive charges and they respond to organic amendments very effectively. So you can apply something like biochar or compost, even any kind of carbon source that's relatively stable. So well aged compost works really well. And you're applying it on a percentage basis of the soil. So it's like 1 to 5% by weight of the soil, which is usually like, in the field, you're doing this by half inch to an inch, per acre, something like that. And that's very effective for, again, those positively charged metals. Now, the other issue is that these are also normally contaminated with arsenic. For some reason, arsenic was just used everywhere back in the day. It was a pesticide, but then also they used it for some like wood treatment cases. Same with copper and chromium. So all these metals were great for all these products, but now we're kind of paying the price for it. But for arsenic, it's negatively charged. So in some cases, if you apply something like compost or an organic amendment, it could actually free up that arsenic in some cases and make it more plant available. So you have to add something that's going to bridge that gap, and that's usually organic matter enriched with iron. And iron really binds up arsenic, and it kind of acts as that bridge to kind of hold it to that organic matter. So that's usually what I recommend. And in the case with the cannabis grower in Western Colorado that I mentioned, what I recommended was biochar enriched with iron. And I calculated out the molar concentration of the iron she needed to add, which should meet the concentration, a 1 to 1 for the arsenic. You don't want to oversupply the iron because iron, it is a micronutrient, but it does tend to tie up nutrients if it's too high in the soil, specifically phosphorus. Phosphorus and arsenic they're also sister elements, and so they have near identical chemistries, which is also why the plants take it up, is that if they need phosphorus and if arsenic's there, they're going to suck up the arsenic too. And so it's really interesting chemistries and interactions. But I recommended the biochar enriched with iron, and it worked quite well. Of course, you had to do it every 1 to 2 years, So, of course, then the iron is going to build up, and so you might have fertility issues with that extra iron. So you have to really manage it quite closely. But it actually worked pretty effectively. The next growing season, the levels of cadmium, arsenic, and lead were so low in her crop that it was fine. She was good to go. So that's a pretty effective treatment. If you just have just an arsenic issue, you can either apply iron, again, enriched, like biochar enriched with iron. Silica also works pretty effectively as well. Silica is a nutrient. It's also a biostimulant, but plants use it for structure, for like physical structure. and it also helps with pests and pathogens and things like that. But what the plant does, if you oversupply silica, it selects for the silica over the arsenic. So it kind of pushes the arsenic out of the way in terms of what the plant sees. So it depends on what you're growing, and if it's a crop that's going to be targeting that, because they don't all target them the same. Like say for example, potatoes. It's a root crop, but it actually doesn't really target lead or cadmium. Kind of like the other root crops do. It actually has these very specific kind of very specific physiology that it excludes some of these metals. Of course, it gets it on the outside. You do have to either peel it or wash it off or something. But it's very crop and metal specific. But there's a lot of different strategies you can do.
And then once they grow the crop, they're testing it through a plant tissue analysis, or how are they testing to see if see if it's worked.
Yeah, so for that, it's kind of like the same digest method for the soil. You just take the plant and you do a plant tissue analysis. That's really kind of the standard. But it also should be noted that you need to break up the plant based on the different parts. Leaves, shoots, and then roots. If you really want to kind of see where it's going and what's being affected, but you normally want to test the parts that are going to be consumed. And that's usually the fruiting bodies or the leaves. And so that's normally what you do is a tissue analysis. And I will also say, um, broadly, what people initially do to remediate their soils is pH management. If you adjust the pH into the right optimal range with lime, and that's what they were initially doing in Thailand, was they were liming the rice fields. That actually precipitates out the cadmium into like a carbonate mineral form that the plants can't take up. So that's normally what you do is you increase the pH. Now, if you increase the pH, that does make arsenic more available. So you kind of have to know what you're working with in your system. I would say consult a soil chemist because who works in this field. I'm always around, but I always like talking about this stuff with people. But kind of knowing what you're working with, if you have more than one element, and what to apply.
Got it. Is there a consumer tool to test this for folks who are eating the food?
Well, actually, the FDA, they do have requirements on certain products that you have to test. But I would say if you're at home, if you're doing like locally sourced food, what you're going to have to do, and I've worked with people on this, is you're going to have to send in some samples if you really are curious. If you are getting food pretty regularly from a locally sourced grower that you might suspect they have contaminated soil, send some of that into a lab, and they'll just digest it and analyze it and give you the results back. And that will at least give you some assurance. But for the most part, things that are mass produced and sold on the market, they do have specific testing requirements that they have to meet because it's all regulated. It's all based on certain exposures you're allowed per amount of food per day per kilogram of body weight. So kids have very strict requirements, adults not so much. But it also depends on how much you're being exposed to. If you're eating the same stuff every day, if you have a heavy leafy green vegetable diet, even if it's, I would say, mass produced, you get it like the local grocery store or something. I would say because leafy greens are considered hyper accumulators of heavy metals in many cases, I would probably, at least be more aware that if you are consuming them, you might need to get them tested or go to the producer to see if they do have data on their product. Because it's the chronic exposure and buildup on a daily basis that really kind of is the big issue in the long run.
Do you see technology advancing in the near future where consumers will have something to test it at their house?
Oh yeah, yeah. So the big thing, and we were using this in Thailand for some of the field work, was handheld X-ray, what they call XRF analyzers, X-ray fluorescence, and it just shoots an X-ray through the plant. And these heavy metals, they actually do respond to that quite effectively, and you get a reading back in terms of concentrations. So you can like hand scan it. Now, wet chemistry is always the tried and true, but that really in your hand, and it's a little expensive, but that will actually give you really hands-on, literally a tool that you can use in the field to scan, leaves, because again, the metals accumulate in the leaves primarily in many species, to kind of like scan the leaves and tell you, is there lead in this? Now, a lot of the contamination, especially for crops that are closer to the surface of the soil, are based on soil disturbance and then deposition onto the plant itself. So it's not going to tell you, is it in the plant or is it on the plant? Can I just wash it? Is this going to be fine? Is this a species that takes up the metal? But you'll see if it's on it, at least that you need to on it or in it, that you at least need to maybe take the extra step to verify, like wash it and then get it analyzed. Okay, did I wash everything off, or is it actually in the plant?
Yeah. Is there any emerging research that you'd say people should growers should look out for over the next few years that might help them on these topics?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the remediation work, mostly because it is getting a little bit cheaper. I work with a few different groups who do different formulations, and they want to test the efficacy of their amendments for reducing heavy metal exposure and uptake in plants. And so a lot of these formulations of like biochar or different mineral formulations, they are getting pretty sophisticated, I would say, and again, more affordable. Those are the big things that are coming out. I haven't seen anything, I would say, in terms of like some sort of like electrochemical or analytical approach to removing it from the soil. A lot of it does come down to topsoil removal and replacement, which is in the millions of dollars, and people really want to avoid that. Like I said, if you're not going to use the soil for anything, just make sure it's covered and don't touch it. But I would say maybe we'll get there one day. It was kind of interesting in Thailand. There was a researcher who had developed this big, I would say, magnetic washing machine. It was in theory, but I think he had actually had a prototype to where he would apply iron to the soil. The cadmium would stick to the iron, and then he would use the magnet to pull out the iron with the cadmium attached to it. Now, iron sticks to a lot of things in the soil, and so you're basically stripping the soil. So you might have fertility issues after that. But if you just want to get the metals out, that's one of those kind of like crazy scientific approaches. I haven't seen anything else like that since. Usually, it just comes down to like removing the soil or adding an amendment. But I would say keep an eye out for something like that. I'm always looking for novel approaches that are affordable.
Yeah, that is the key. I can't imagine removing all your topsoil would be very affordable. Have you seen people do that? Like, what is their process for doing that?
Oh yeah. I'm actually working with someone now who's going through this as well. They just acquired some land that they found was near an old, I think it was like metal processing site, and it has very high lead in it. And so what they're wanting to do is replace the topsoil. So what you have to do is find an area with clean topsoil. You can't get it local. I mean, local-ish if you have a clean source. But they have to go through the whole process of knowing how deep the contamination is. Normally, with many metals, it only stays in the top part of the soil profile. So like 0 to 6 inches. I would say at the deepest. Now, in some of these other places, they do have like old I guess waste pits. Where they're like burying cars and anything they had that was a waste. They had some pretty deep heavy metal contamination. So you have to first assess, how deep is this? But again, it's usually in the top part of the soil, which does make it easier. But then you have to go through and you scrape off that whole top part of the soil. You bring in the clean soil and you spread it evenly. And you typically make sure that it's enriched with something like biochar or organic matter or something. But you have to go through the whole process of assessing the soil, assessing the clean soil, all the physical laborious movements of the old soil, getting it landfilled, getting the clean soil in, and that's why it costs in the millions of dollars to get this stuff done.
Yeah, that's rough. What are some of the things that you would leave the audience with today? Maybe a little bit more detail on how you plan on presenting your session at the conference, what they can walk away with.
Yeah, so the focus is heavy metals and specialty crops, and that's pretty broad. But really, it comes down to know your site history. So if you are acquiring land for the first time, and I've worked with someone actually last week. They were going through this, and I said, "Well, do you know anything about the site history?" And he told me it was like an old dairy and things like that, and it transitioned into row crops for like 30 years. And I knew like arsenic can build up in lead and some of these old dairies just from excrement buildup. So know the site history, know what to look for, because you can actually test for quite a bit. If you're absolutely paranoid, you can break the bank, in terms of what you're going to be looking at, especially if you're looking at, like, say, historic organic contaminant, pollution. So old herbicides, pesticides, anything like that, those get expensive. Those are quite expensive tests. And plus, you really have to know what you're looking for because the spectrum is so broad. But for metals, it's not super expensive. You can test pretty much all of them in one sweep. So know the site history, know what you're going to use the land for. Is it something that's going to be a risky crop? If so, switch to a different crop if possible, or find something that you can put into the soil to keep it in the soil and not in the plant. So know the metal, know the crop that's going to be sensitive to it. In some cases, you don't even have to do anything because the plant won't select for it. Or you can do a bioavailability test, do like a DTPA extract of that soil, see what's actually going to be pulled out. That's kind of what the plant's going to see. Or send in some of the plants if you have plants that you see on site. I mean, pretty much anything. Just see if the plants are sucking up any of it. Get that tested. So, kind of taking those steps, be sure and ask questions about that land. Once you get it, you got it. So know the site history and then know how to test it from there. It's not the end of the world. You can do things that are affordable to reduce the exposure risks, but kind of the prevention is going to be a big part of it. And even residential areas too. If you're getting a house that's in a known kind of contaminated area, like an old orchard site, like in central Washington, they have like hundreds of thousands of acres that are contaminated with lead and arsenic. Kind of know that, get some information if you can. They don't always disclose that, because you won't buy it if they tell you it's covered in heavy metals. So kind of know what to ask and kind of go from there.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. It's kind of depressing, but I think it's important to have people working on stuff like this. So we appreciate your time and looking forward to having you talk at the conference. You're scheduled on December 4th at the Thursday of the conference at 1 o'clock. So you have an hour and 15 minutes to discuss this with folks at the conference.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully people will come up with a lot of information that they can use. It's always like you said, it's depressing. It's always a conversation starter. But I think they should get a lot of good information from this. And I'm always around for follow-ups if people have any other things they need to ask me about.
Yeah, absolutely. And make sure you check out Ward Labs and anywhere else you'd like to direct people to.
I would say, well, I don't know of any other companies right now other than us that are doing some of this testing. But if I do, I can always forward that along, any sort of like biochar company or something like that.
Yeah, well, we have plenty of biochar companies coming to the conference too. So
that's perfect.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Freeze, we appreciate your time and we look forward to seeing you in about a month.
Yep. Thanks, Taylor. Yeah, me too.
Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.